Assalamualaikum and very good evening. Welcome to the 10th series of Professor Adjunct series of Faculty of Social Science and Humanities. So this is a 10th series. Can you imagine we have a fruitful journey of sharing by our Professor Adjunct series. If you would like to see all of the video, you can check it available in the given playlist. I will put it later so you guys can catch up with all the playlist of the videos by our Professor Adjunct series. So check it out. And for those who are first time with us, don't forget to like and share this video so that everyone can benefit from this sharing. And we will give the attendance about 30 minutes when the session starts. So I really hope that everyone really looking forward for the session. Cause I've heard everyone was discussing about the previous lecture on the constructivist learning. So I'm looking forward for engaging session for today. So without further ado, I would like to invite our dean, Professor Dr. Zaida Tuntasi, to the stage to give a welcoming remark for the 10th series of Professor Adjunct. Welcome, Prof. Zaida, to the stage.
Assalamualaikum. Very good afternoon to all. Thank you, Dr. Nina. Yeah, I would like to welcome all of you to FSS Adjunct Professors Lecture Series. Today is the series number 10 and we have our honorable speaker, Professor Dr. Kit S. Tabor, with the titles of 7 slogans for constructivist teacher, key ideas for teaching in accordance with learning theory. As did mentioned by Nina, this is the third time Prof. Dr. Keith Tabor sharing his view on teaching and learning, and the last one is on constructivist, and today also is about constructivist. As we know that nowadays at the situations of COVID-19 pandemics, all of courses, including in Malaysia, in some other countries, we're having what call it totally online learning environments at the higher eds and some schools in Malaysia. So as we know that students actually when they actually face online learning medium for teaching and learning, the words that we should have to remember is that the student must learn with the media and not from the media. So if we thought that we are using online learning tool as part of only a tools for delivering of instruction, I think that's not actually the right situation, because with the advancements of technology, we have to know that the student now have to learn with the media. And the constructivism, as we know, is founded on the ideas that learning is an active process of exploration from multiple perspectives, resulting in knowledge being constructed from a personal interpretation of the experience. And nowadays, with the situations of online learning, including in Malaysia, the learning community has been changed a lot. I believe the learning community is not only consists of students and their classmates, but it will consist about their parents, their sisters, their brothers, even their neighbors also is part of the learning communities nowadays. And constructivism is the approach, is a school of thought, is the learning theories that align with the situations of we are having totally online learning situation nowadays. And the constructivism, I think, explain a lot that people learn by constructing their own knowledge and understanding by interacting with the environments and the people around them. And in this situation, the people around the students, our student, is no longer their friends, but people around them. It might be their families, their neighbors, their sisters, brothers, and including if we have students at the postgraduate levels, their sons and their daughter also will be part of the learning communities. So as we know that learning through an online medium can be recognized more as a social network relation, and where learners will interact with content, expert, peer, society, environments, technology, and surrounding in the acquisition of knowledge. Therefore, the titles that will be delivered by Professor Dr. Kit S. Tabor today is very related to our situation nowadays in higher ed and also in school in Malaysia. So, with the title of 7 slogans for constructivist teachers, key ideas for teaching in accordance with learning theory, I think this is the right title for us to spend about might be 1.5 hours to hear some of the experience and sharing talk from our professor Dr. Keith Tabor from University of Cambridge. I think with that, welcome again to all the audience from Facebook and also from YouTube channels. Thank you very much again, Professor Dr. Keith Tabor. I hope this is not going to be the last time that you join us in our Adjunct Professors Lecture Series. We will invite you in the future, near future, so that we can have two ways of sharing sessions from your university and from yourself also to our friend here in Malaysia. And for your information, this event also we co-organize with Academy Professor just to support the programs that we have together in academia, so that this is how we show the relationship between university and academy professors of Malaysia. I think that's all. I back to you, Nina. I end my welcoming remarks with wabillahi taufiq wa hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh.
Thank you so much, our Dean, Prof. Zaida, for the welcoming remarks. Yep, Prof. Zaida have highlighted it. Yes, this is the first time we actually collaborate with Academy Professor Malaysia. So it's a very great opportunity for us to actually learn from Prof. Keith Tabor again. And if I'm not mistaken, he actually prepares about 6 weeks for this lecture. So can you imagine how he put his hearts to this sharing? So I really hope that everyone could benefit from this sharing. And for those who are first time with us, again, please like and do share this video so that it will, reach a wider audience. And also, for those who wants to view this video, we also have the video playlist. You can watch it in the given link. I also put it in the Facebook comment. So please hit the link if you want to see all the videos. So for those who are first time attending Prof. Keith Tabor, he actually have the pre-lecture notes. So you can also access the pre-lecture notes so that you can have the idea of today's lecture as well. So that's it. So before that, I would like to invite our moderator, the chair of School of Education, Professor Fatin Alia Fang, to the stage to moderate the session.
Okay, Assalamualaikum, Dr. Nina. How are you?
Hello. Good, Prof.
Okay,
The
thank you.
yours.
Thank you, Nina. Assalamualaikum and good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. My name is Fatin. I'll be moderating the session today. I think it will be our final Adjunct Professor Lecture Series with Professor Keith Tabor. Professor Keith Tabor, has been giving lectures for our Adjunct Professor UTM lectures for a few times, and the previous talk is about the basic about constructivism, and now we are moving on with the second topic, 7 slogans of constructive teachers, key ideas for teaching in accordance with learning theory. Just to introduce Professor Keith Tabor, he is the Emeritus Professor of Science Education at the University of Cambridge. He used to be a science teacher teaching chemistry and physics at schools in England, and then he continued to continue his study in PhD, and then became a lecturer and then professor at the University of Cambridge Faculty of Education. And he has been he is still editorial board members for numerous high impact journals in the world, like for example International Journal of Science Education, Studies in Science Education, and so on. And he's also members of a few Royal Societies in UK and around the world. So I think he is the best person to talk about science education, and especially about constructivism. That's the learning theories that a lot of people has been applying. But what are the fundamentals? What are the key concepts? What are the key ideas behind this theory? I think a lot of people do not know. And if you're using active learning, if you're using prompt-based learning, if you're using project-based learning, a lot of learning methods that you'll be using, probably they are coming from the roots of constructivism. So that's why it's very important to understand today's lecture. Without further ado, I want to invite Professor Keith Tabor to join us. Prof. Keith.
Good morning. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Prof. Keith, for joining us today. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
It's sunny. I'm fine, thank you. It's sunny in England.
It is, for a first time for a while, sunny in England.
For a while. I hope you are keeping yourself well. You done your vaccine, COVID vaccine?
I had my first dose.
Right. You look good. Okay. Now, before we go into the lecture, just a few words about. I know you are now the Emeritus Professor of Science Education at Cambridge, and you're still working with Cambridge at the moment.
Well, I've still got some research students who haven't finished yet.
Right. So there'll be just the left, and you are retired from Cambridge, right? Officially.
Officially retired, yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Keith. I think I will leave this session to you for your lecture. Please. Thank you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you very much, Fatin. Right, I'm sharing my screen. Can somebody just confirm you can see that okay?
Yes, Prof. We could see it clearly.
Excellent. Thank you very much. In my previous lecture, I reviewed key ideas about the nature of learning as a fundamental to a constructivist perspective on learning. In that lecture, it suggested that our understanding of the nature of learning should inform the work of teachers, whether working in schools, universities, or elsewhere. This lecture explores the nature of teaching that fits with constructivist learning theory. I've signified these key ideas in a series of slogans or mottos. I find such slogans can be useful placeholders when thinking about teaching, and I hope others will also find them useful. The 7 slogans are: make the unfamiliar familiar, share the learner's starting point, be a tour guide, not a roadmap, identify learning quanta, the learner's resolution, find the optimum level of simplification, mediate challenge with support, and drip feed reinforcement. I hope that by the end of the lecture you'll understand what I mean by these terms and how they relate to what we found out about the nature of learning and how they may be applied in teaching. In an ideal teaching situation, the teacher has plenty of time to prepare classes, to get to know students, and to work with them in a very interactive fashion. In reality, there may be limitations in actual practice. But if we keep in mind the ideal and seek opportunities to work towards it, we're likely to be better teachers even if we never become perfect. Indeed, knowing that we're not yet perfect is probably a useful motivator to do better in the future. This is, to my mind, the essence of teaching. When learning occurs, something that wasn't previously familiar has become familiar. Human beings naturally learn through their experiences of the world. They learn that dropped glasses often shatter, or that too many cakes and biscuits may lead to a queasy feeling. In education, however, we're generally involved in teaching things that are unlikely to be learned spontaneously because they're unlikely to be familiar from everyday experience. Sometimes things that are unfamiliar from everyday experience are not familiar because they're rare, or dangerous, or on an inaccessible scale. Sometimes they're just specialised. So, for example, laboratory apparatus is not usually met outside laboratories. Sometimes what is unfamiliar is readily available in the culture, but may not seem relevant to students unless they are nudged towards it. I'm thinking here of what might be termed high culture, where students from different social backgrounds may have different social capital in terms of what is available and discussed in the home. Of course, there are value judgments to be made about which forms of culture are worth sharing. After all, picking pockets and taking narcotics are undoubtedly aspects of culture in many societies. But that does not mean we wish to induct young people into these behaviours. However, often in formal education, things are unfamiliar for a different reason. Things that we're asked to teach about are often unfamiliar because they don't really exist. I mean, they are abstractions. They are not things that a person will find in the street, pick up, handle, prod, or test by dropping on a hard surface. A good deal of school education and higher education is not about teaching about objects or events as such, but as generalizations, as concepts. There is no such thing as price elasticity of demand, for example, that you can take out of your pocket to show anyone. The concept refers to an abstracted feature of a complex system. So the teacher may have the task of making sure students recognise price elasticity of demand, or an electric field, or a molecular orbital when they see one. But first they have to learn how to see these things, as they do not exist as directly observable phenomena in the world. So we might say There's nothing to see. Perhaps it seems contrary to suggest that people can learn to see things that do not really exist. It might be suggested this is just a sloppy way of saying that people learn to, after the event, conceptualize phenomena in terms of these abstract ideas. But actually, with sufficient familiarity, you can learn to perceive these things. Just as when you see a bicycle, you do not need to do a deliberate analysis to identify that's what you're seeing. This has become automatic. I do not know what this picture actually shows, but I immediately know what is meant to be represented, and I see DNA. Indeed, I can immediately see DNA in a range of actually quite different representations. Something similar happens in all of us with learning to hear language. We start just hearing sounds, but as adults we automatically hear words, usually without any deliberate effort. A newborn baby cannot initially see a bicycle or a coconut or an elephant, but with sufficient familiarity we all learn to interpret sensory data, so we do come to see such things. The same cognitive processes can help us to see electric fields or inflation or corruption, but this takes some work. The same entity may have several different identities according to context. If a child is taken to a forest and a tree is pointed out to her, how does she know if the signifier tree means a single plant or the collective, or the tree with its soil, or just a trunk, or just a bark, or that branch? And does tree refer to any of these big plants, or just one type, or just this one particular example? If you know what coffee refers to, then it's obvious what's being pointed to here. But otherwise, just pointing is not enough, as there are a range of potential reference, including the finger itself. So if you're charged with teaching learners what is meant by a conical flask or flat-bottomed flask, it's wise to do more than just point at one while giving its name. However, if you're charged with teaching learners what is meant by the Enlightenment, or a hybrid atomic orbital, or moment of inertia, or a monopoly, you cannot simply just point to one. Here are some things you cannot teach by having learners pass them around the class. You cannot readily teach such things by ostension, by naming and pointing. One way we can teach about such intangibles is through definitions, careful logical delineations of these concepts. Yet in practice, a definition is often only helpful after someone has acquired the concept. Definitions are important to the expert community, but of limited value to a novice. When we do offer definitions, but always depending upon the learner's existing concepts, we always need to build with the conceptual bricks learners have available. Here is a concept with a multi-part definition, where we have to work with abstract representations. Learners can be asked to identify examples and non-examples, and also to explain their assignment in each case. So we make unfamiliar familiar through representations, such as models, and for identifying similarities with what's already familiar to the learner. I expect everyone at this lecture knows what a T-Rex looks like, and you can probably form a mental image of a water molecule or a magnetic field. Even though none of you have ever seen a living T-Rex, a water molecule is too small to be seen, and a magnetic field is not visible. Teachers will be fluent in the use of representation. However, we have to remember that students need to learn the representation first and become comfortable with it before they can adopt it as part of their reservoir of interpretive resources. We use verbal models too, in the form of metaphor, simile, and analogy, as well as narrative and sometimes anthropomorphism. You may notice I use a range of metaphors, analogies, and images in this lecture. We should be explicit with our students regarding the limitation of these devices. Even if there is a sense in which, say, a nucleus is like the brains of a cell, or an atom is like a tiny planetary system, there are also many differences. So these metaphors and similes and models and analogies and all the rest are very useful ways of making the unfamiliar familiar, but should be seen as a kind of scaffolding, a temporary structure that will be discarded once what was unfamiliar has become familiar. We look for anchors in existing experience and handholds in which to grasp new territory. Moving on in more ways than one, I'm going to adopt a metaphor of my own, conceptual learning as a journey. Or at least one can consider conceptual learning as a kind of journey, but not through the phenomenal world we experience as such, but through the world of ideas. The teacher seeks to move the learner through what might be called concept space. Now, unfortunately, education has commonly been designed backwards. In most formal education systems, there's a destination set out for the journey. The curriculum tells the teacher where the learners need to get to by the end of a semester, or by the end of a grade level, or by the end of a programme of study. The teacher has limited class time, so the teacher feels she cannot start too far from the next specified destination, which is fine, of course, as long as the learners are near enough to where the teacher feels she needs to start. In practice, this is often not the case, so some logic has to be applied. If the learners are not where we would hope they would be, or where the curriculum document suggests they should be, we have two options. Option one is to ignore this and carry on regardless. After all, you're supposed to be teaching grade 10 students or second year undergraduates or whatever. It's not your fault if these grade 10 students or second year undergraduates are not where they're expected to be in concept space. The best thing to do is teach as if they are and finish the assigned curriculum. Most of the learners are very unlikely to reach the expected destination in this approach, but you are teaching what you are expected to teach. You cannot be blamed as you have taught the course materials, even if you have perhaps not really taught the students very much. The other approach is to find out where the learners are and start teaching from their starting points, and then move them on as far towards the destination as you can, even if it seems very unlikely you can get them all the way to the intended destination from there in the time available. Neither of these strategies are likely to allow the students to all perform excellently in an externally imposed final examination matched to the curriculum. So the difference here is how you see the role of the teacher. If the teacher's job is to teach the curriculum, then the first approach makes sense. If the teacher's job is actually to teach students, then the second approach makes more sense. My notion of teaching as action intended to bring about learning better fits this second approach, where some useful learning is more likely. Imagine you had arranged for your favourite aunt to come and visit you and suggested she gets off the train at a certain railway station where you would meet her. If she called you to say she'd made a mistake and missed the stop and had got off the train at the next station a kilometre further along the line, what would you do? You could go and collect her from the station where she actually is, even if that wasn't the original plan. Or you could ignore the actual situation and instead stick to the plan by going to meet her at the station where she was supposed to be. I wonder how many people listening today actually think it would be better to go to the planned station to meet someone that you actually know is somewhere else. Perhaps no one. Yet teachers are encouraged through the instruments of curriculum documents, schemes of work and formal exams to do this all the time. What this means is that teaching should always start with diagnostic assessment, finding out where the learners currently are. Have they covered the expected prerequisite knowledge? Do they have common alternative conceptions that interfere with understanding the concepts to be taught? Diagnostic assessment need not mean a formal exam. There are plenty of probes that can be used, such as concept cartoons or tasks like concept mapping. And often these activities can be set up as paired work or group work to be followed by classroom discussion. The aim is not to grade or score, but to learn about the student's current understandings and thinking. So it's not a problem if students work together. It is actually likely to be useful to the teacher. The teacher can learn a good deal from listening to their conversations. If it makes sense to you that you should share rather than ignore the learner's starting point, then I think my next slogan is likely to resonate as well. The teacher has expert knowledge of the topic to be taught and the subject that it's drawn from. The teacher can devise a logical route for the conceptual journey. The teacher can see which features of the scenery are important to notice, and what the significant stopping off points should be. An effective teaching scheme has to reflect disciplinary structure and logic, and it has to emphasise the pedagogically most important matters. Of course, the learners do not yet have access to disciplinary structure and logic, as that is exactly what they're meant to be learning. So from the learner's perspective, the subject or topics may look very different. As they explore the scenery, they may easily become fascinated by points which are not very important or relevant from the expert perspective. And they may be easily enticed down side streets or alleyways which takes them off course. When on the logical journey of conceptual learning, a short detour could mean we never really catch up with the teacher. The teacher needs to keep in mind that because of their expertise, they have an overview of the territory and a familiarity with the destination not available to learners who are just having the experience of finding their way around a new location and for whom the intended destination is not yet in sight. A teacher's presentation is designed to be understood by learners, and it's assumed they will have available the background knowledge and will understand how and when to link new material with those foundations. Yet they may be missing prior learning, or they may not make the expected links with previous lessons, or they may interpret teaching in terms of non-canonical alternative conceptions, or they may make creative but unhelpful links with unrelated background knowledge. The teacher therefore doesn't just point the way, but needs to be there to cajole and encourage, and to respond to what may be genuine, if not entirely pertinent questions, and to carefully take learners by the hand when they're in danger of inadvertently taking a wrong turn. That is, of course, all metaphor. What this actually means is teaching in a conversational way. Conversational doesn't mean being overly informal or focusing on social talk rather than discipline itself. When the teacher talks and the students only listen, then the teacher may assume everything is understood as intended, but has no way to tell until the evidence of poor homework or disappointing test scores is available. What is needed is ongoing dialogue, which offers formative assessment that helps the teacher to see where the students actually are, to see if they have wandered into the shopping centre when they were meant to be heading on to the museum. In this way, the teacher deals with misunderstandings and misinterpretations or failures to make sense at the time, rather than only discovering them later. In school teaching, this is likely to mean that most of the class time is spent on activities where the learners work with ideas and the teacher can monitor what they're saying, doing and writing. In lecture courses, it's possible to interject various short activities into lectures, such as quick multiple choice questions, or asking students to work in pairs or small groups on some question or discussion point.
Prof, yeah.
Active learning means active minds, and even mature students who can concentrate on listening to an engaging teacher for modest periods benefit from short breaks to process what they've heard. My next point is closely related to the last one, and it concerns the planning of the conceptual journey that the teacher is hoping to take the learners on. One of the key features of human learning is the limited capacity of working memory, which is central to all the deliberate thinking we do. Working memory is where we plan and where we do the conscious part of problem solving, and where we test whether we understand things, and where we make those connections between what we're being told now and what we already know and understand. Even though our brains are at any time dealing with a wide range of complex information, In working memory, we focus on only a tiny fraction of this at any moment. The term working memory is unfortunate, as information is only held there very transiently, unless we actively rehearse it. And a better term might be the executive processor. The executive processor may crudely be considered to have a very limited number of slots for information. Probably we have about 5 to 6 slots available at most to do any of the deliberate manipulation necessary to study, or to address problems, or to analyse a situation. Once we reach adulthood, the number of working memory slots is then fixed for the rest of our lives. But we can use those slots more effectively due to a process called chunking. Chunking is where we learn to appreciate complexes as coherent wholes. Someone who'd never seen a bicycle in their life might, on first coming across one, not recognise a single machine, perceive the wheels and the handlebars, the chain, the brake pads, the pedals, the frame as discrete objects. We have learned to see the bike as a single unit. Imagine you got to know Farah when she came to work in the faculty. You also met Ashraf when he joined your badminton club. When Farah invited you to her birthday party, she introduced you to her husband, Ashraf. While you still recognise Farah and Ashraf as unique individuals, you also now know Farah and Ashraf as a couple, so you're able to think of them as one entity. If you were arranging a couple's 10-pin bowling competition, you wouldn't think of inviting Farah and Ashraf to collectively take up one slot. The important point here is you haven't lost knowledge of Farah or Ashraf as discrete people, but are able to both see them as a couple and also to analyse the entity down to its component partners. This is a simple example, but the principle is broad. We learn to build up complexes that we can treat as one item, but which we can still decompose their constitutive parts as well. This means that the complexity of some object or conceptual framework in relation to how it can be manipulated is subjective, depending on the familiarity of the material to individuals. Here is an image. If you've been to the pre-lecture site, you may have already had a look at this example. Most of you will recognise this immediately. If you wanted to tell someone later what you saw, you would tell them it was a Malay flag. They would immediately know what you had seen. It occupies one slot in the memory. However, if I was telling someone in my family who's not familiar with Malaysia about the image, I would have to explain that it was a flag, and then describe how it's divided into 2 regions, the top left quarter having a royal blue background, and gold symbols of a crescent and a 14-point star, and the rest being 14 alternating red and white stripes of equal width, with the top stripe being red. That might be enough to exceed working memory capacity. The same information can be treated as one unit when it's chunked, but it's only chunked when someone has previously spent time and effort familiarising themselves with it. That is, if I ask you to think about or remember this image, you already know it and can visualise it as an organised whole. Here is another example. For a chemistry teacher, an expert, this is understood as a single coherent chunk of information that fits within one slot of working memory. It also immediately suggests a wide range of other associations, such as types of substances and reactions. It embodies ideas about conservation of mass. It links a description of how substances behave to a model in terms of molecules and chemical bonds. Yet all of that is learned, and to a novice, this is a complex string of symbols that does not yet have any unitary coherent identity. These 2 additional schemes link to ideas about conservation of mass and conservation of charge, and must look to a novice to add a whole complex mess of additional detail. But to an expert, all of this material is familiar and fits into a coherent scheme. Indeed, to the expert, all this additional material is already inherently implied by and implicit in the original equation. It is the linking and association of related ideas that enables the expert to both chunk complex material and to move about the conceptual web of their discipline with relative ease. None of this is available to a novice. A teacher planning a lesson has to think how complex a concept or topic might appear to a learner and what interpretive resources they have to understand it. It's not how this conceptual journey appears to the expert that matters, but how it will be seen from the perspective of the novice with limited background knowledge, fragile prior learning, and limited integration of material into conceptual networks. Our teaching will be seen at the learner's resolution, not the teacher's. So it needs to make sense at the learner's resolution. So when breaking down a topic into learning quanta, these must be manageable and digestible quanta of learning from the learner's own perspective. After all, it's no good giving a newborn baby a Greek salad for dinner on the basis that that works fine as a meal for the parents. The educational thinker Jerome Bruner famously claimed that we could teach a learner of any age, any subject, in an intellectually honest way. What he meant by intellectually honest was, although we may teach a simplified version, not the whole truth, it would still be an authentic account. It would still be true, if not comprehensive. I suspect Bruner was being a little provocative, but his claim is certainly one teachers can find aspirational. Many of the abstract ideas we teach in education are very complex. Models and concepts that are originally simple may have over time acquired increasing levels of sophistication in order to be useful in thinking about a wider range of phenomena, or in order to predict more precise outcomes. Many ideas have been discussed by various thinkers adopting different perspectives and commitments. So it's probably impossible to offer a simple account of, say, Romanticism, or positivism, or pragmatism, or the Baroque, which encompass a breadth of scholarly thinking. We cannot start teaching with the most advanced current canonical accounts of disciplinary knowledge, but we need to simplify. Every time we simplify something sophisticated, by stripping away some of its complexity and subtlety, we do two things. We both make it more accessible for a novice and make it a less authentic version of the original. As an analogy, think again about a bicycle. We all come to recognize a particular configuration of many parts that is a bicycle as a single object. We are also able to immediately recognize a wide range of quite different bikes as being instances of the bicycle. We could remove mudguards, the pump, the water bottle, the bell, the panniers, the lights and the reflectors, and we would have lost some utility that can sometimes be really valuable, but we would still have a basic bicycle. But if we remove the chain or the brakes, we've lost some of the core functionality that allows us to use a bicycle properly. If we remove one of the wheels, we do not even have a bicycle anymore, as it's part of the very essence of a bicycle that it has two wheels. In the same way, some simplifications lose what is essential in an idea, such that the simplification may not be a good basis for later progression to more complex accounts, and such simplifications may even act as learning impediments that mislead students. There is an attention. The more we simplify, the more accessible something becomes to a novice learner. However, the more we simplify, the less we are teaching an authentic version of the target concept or theory. We need to find optimal levels of simplification. That is, we simplify enough for ideas to be accessible to the learners based on the interpretive resources they have available, which we find out by diagnostic assessment. We do not simplify more than we need to in order to make the ideas accessible for those students. And we do not simplify in ways that impede progression to more advanced models or accounts that the student might meet later. In my own area of teaching, I've often seen simplifications presented in teaching getting in the way of learners making progress. Of course, what is the right level depends on the level of the students and will vary from group to group at different stages of the education system. And this is one area where educational research can help teachers to know which simplifications are the most optimal. My next slogan also refers to finding a balance between opposing considerations. I want to draw a rough distinction between learning activities which support development and those that do not. By development, I mean acquiring new skills, new concepts, new associations, new perspectives. That is surely what education is about. Yet a lot of classroom activity involves students exercising the skills, knowledge and understanding they've already acquired, rather than moving forward. Now, I'm not suggesting that exercising is not important, but I question if we always get the balance right. The polymath and educational thinker Lev Vygotsky introduced the idea of a kind of imaginary multidimensional space, which represents the individual's various competencies. In relation to any particular area of learning, this space is divided into 3 zones. One zone reflects activity the learner is fully capable of without any help. Work set in this zone can be completed well without any support from the teacher. We can imagine the classroom of learners all getting on with their work and looking relaxed and untroubled, or the lecture room full of happy smiling faces, clearly fully understanding everything they're being told, because what they're being told includes nothing substantially new to them. Work set in one of the other zones is quite different. Here the student will not understand the task, will not have a clue what to do, and will be totally lost and likely frustrated. Students will not even be able to engage in the set tasks, or they'll be listening to a lecture much as if it's been spoken in an unfamiliar foreign language. No learning will take place. However, there is a third zone, intermediate between these two. Here tasks will be designed or presentations will be pitched, so they again go beyond the current competence or knowledge of the learner, but such that learners can at least appreciate the challenges and how it relates to previous learning. In this zone, students are not ready to complete the work unaided, but they can start to make progress when given some clues or help or modelling. Vygotsky's argument was it was only in the intermediate zone, the so-called zone of proximal development, that students would be able to make the kind of progress we might call development, rather than just practicing and finessing their existing accomplishments. So, as with so much in life, we need to choose the option that involves the right level of challenge for both students and teacher if we want to get the most out of the experience. So a teacher needs to set challenging learning activities, but also provide support. Support that allows the student to make progress in the zone is known as scaffolding. Over time, the students will achieve mastery and no longer need the support. Then we slip back into the first zone and it's time to increase the challenge a little bit. Now, there's a very big complication here, of course, which is that every learner is unique. Locating a task in one student's construction zone often makes that task much too easy for another student to genuinely challenge them, and yet out of reach for another, such they're not ready to engage with it, even with modest scaffolding. There's not an easier solution. Personalised learning may require unrealistic levels of teacher preparation time and may lose the social cohesion within a class of students who feel they're moving along the same path together. Yet simply aiming for some kind of median level leaves behind some and also fails to challenge the most advanced students and help them development. There can be a middle way using differentiation by support. That is, learning activities are designed to be challenging for all, but graduated levels of scaffolding are provided to support different learners in the class. Scaffolding is intended to be temporary. It's provided by the learners need support and faded once they develop mastery. The metaphor of scaffolding poles refers to support provided by the teacher to help the learners reach beyond their current level of mastery. As in building a house, once the construction is completed, the scaffolding will no longer be needed. Here is an illustrative example of a task which is designed to allow students to appreciate a scientific principle through guided discovery. Some learners may need a few hints to set them off in the right direction. Others may need a lot more hand-holding to guide them through the activity. Often it may be possible to encourage group work where students mediate each other's learning. It is certainly not right to require more advanced students to act as tutors for the benefit of their classmates. But we all know that teaching and preparing to teach are incredibly powerful learning activities. So it may be possible to design roles for some learners to support the learning of others in ways that benefit both parties. This can be in direct face-to-face work or helping develop learning support materials, for example. It's also possible to set mini-projects with differentiated roles and responsibilities, such that although a team has a common task, it can be broken down in ways that mean everybody is being stretched, yet also enabled by the support available. My final slogan relates to the nature of long-term memory. We do not know exactly how the mechanisms of memory work, but there's a lot of research on how memory functions. If you viewed the previous lecture, you may remember some of the things said about memory there. There seem to be at least 3 stages of memorizing once material is no longer in working memory with its very restricted capacity. Our initial memories of daily experience are only retained in a temporary and fragile form. If normal functioning is interrupted, say by the bang on the head so beloved of fiction writers, we can suffer amnesia and all those temporary memories are lost. The second stage occurs some hours later, when some kind of permanent trace is made in the brain, presumably in terms of changes in connections in synapses, which when subsequently activated allow us to remember something. These traces are provided with a temporary means of access, a bit like new books arriving in a library or bookshop being initially simply classified as new stock. The third stage is typically something that begins over a period of days, which is the activation of these new memories and their linking with other material represented in memory. Although this may start over a period of a few days, this process can actually continue over very, very long periods. In our analogy, our librarian picks up the book from the pile of new stock, identifies its catalogue number, and moves the book to the correct section of the library. But memory representations do not have any inherent catalogue numbers, and are not physically moved around the brain, but rather are given new connections. So it's actually more like the new book being connected by strings to other related books. This seems more messy, but has the advantage that potentially we can link this new memory with several existing representations, rather than have to put it just on one single shelf. So this is actually more like a publisher's website, where you may notice the same book is often listed under several different headings. The more listings a book has, the more readily it'll be found by potential customers. In the same way, the more links a memory has, the more likely it is to be activated later. Many of the books that arrive never get catalogued in this way and end up in a disordered pile as they get displaced. In the same way, most memories are effectively lost from the system. Interestingly, brain surgeons who work on conscious patients to probe brain areas before removing diseased tissue report that sometimes electrical stimulation activates a memory a person hasn't experienced for decades. But this approach is not usually considered appropriate in teaching. So something that we have been told in a lesson or lecture may never be represented in the memory. If it is, and that memory trace isn't activated on the days immediately following, then it's likely to be just another lost volume, out of sight and out of mind. This is why students should always start reviewing their class notes within a few days of any lesson or class. When recent learning is regularly reviewed and applied in different contexts, it becomes embedded in a network of connections and is more readily recalled. Teachers can support the process of reinforcing and consolidating learning. You should identify the key ideas and principles and themes in the course and introduce these as early as possible in the programme. So, for example, when I was asked to teach an introductory lecture for a course, I looked to include key concepts and terminology that students would meet during the course. It was made very clear that all these ideas would be picked up during the course later, and it wasn't expected that students would remember everything from the original lecture. Students were told that this was intended to give them an overview of the territory and the route they would take through it. When planning your classes, you then look for every opportunity to highlight and review what has been previously taught, and indeed to drop in tasters or perhaps teasers as preparation for the teaching to come. You identify key concepts, principles, technical terms, and so forth, and look for every opportunity to see how they link between class sessions. You then ask the students to make the links. School teachers often do this as a matter of course, but it may seem an awkward thing to do in a lecture to adult students. Yet it's quite possible to build this approach into a lecture by briefly revisiting slides or images or definitions, etc. from previous classes at any point where you might be hoping learners will be linking back to these ideas. As one example, here's a simple teaching model of an idea that some students find very abstract and difficult to link to their own research projects in a meaningful way. This was introduced early and then revisited in a wide range of contexts later, where the prior learning was both reinforced and extended through new applications, and where the now familiar model also helped anchor new learning about new topics. Earlier, I suggested that although practice is important, there's a danger of too much class time being spent on exercises to practice a taught idea before moving on to something new. It's likely to both be better support learning and to better encourage engagement if we avoid too much practice through repetitive exercises immediately after meeting an idea, and instead look to challenge students to frequently review ideas at different times and in different contexts. You can even reprise slides with modest changes to challenge learners to complete missing details. The idea of revisiting previous teaching also links with the idea of scaffolding. Whenever we introduce new ideas which build upon previous teaching, we have to be aware that prior learning may not be readily brought to mind, and students may not be well placed to appreciate how prior learning is relevant to the new learning. This just may not be obvious to the learner's resolution. So before asking students to apply previous ideas in a new way, it's useful to give them a brief warm-up activity, such as this one. To simply revisit the ideas they're being asked to recall and remind them of the key aspects that may be relevant to the new task. We might think of this kind of activity as helping learners identify which prior knowledge we're asking them to use in a new task, and to remind them how it fits together before applying it. This drip feeding teaching is not simply another label for the spiral curriculum. The spiral curriculum refers to designing teaching programs such that complex ideas are met in increasingly sophisticated forms at different stages, so that the complexity can be built up as the learner develops. Typically, the spiral turns once a year, or in some school systems, the same topic may only be met again after another 2 or 3 grades. The principle of the spiral curriculum assumes that what is learnt in one term will be available a year or so later to be developed, and without some extensive work to revisit and consolidate learning, that's usually not going to be the case. Without deliberate and regular review, even if a student remembers having met the topic, any recalled details will likely be partial, vague, and even distorted. Memory is not really a place where we store things, but rather a representation like an image or symbol. So remembering is largely reconstructive. That is, the brain has to construct the memory from a representation that's incomplete and open to interpretation. There's a good deal of evidence of this. Research suggests that sometimes students remember what they've been taught in the lesson, but in a distorted form that might even be totally contrary to the original teaching. A memory that's not activated is a bit like a guitar or violin which has not been played. It will need retuning. Each time we activate a memory, we potentially modify it, which can be bad if the representation drifts away from the original learning, but it can be a good thing if we use the opportunity to not only reinforce the intended learning, but also to strengthen links. I've attempted to design this lecture to build on what I said in the lecture on learning, and to have some links between recurring themes and motives. And most of all, to hopefully link with ideas, experiences, metaphors and images likely to be familiar to those listening. If I failed, and I suspect your recall of this lecture will be something like my slide here: confused, partial, and not entirely accurate. The teacher can reinforce recently introduced ideas so they become integrated into memory, and then continue over the longer term to keep reviewing key ideas in the context of a constantly expanding web of meanings. Constant encouragement to find and use examples and links between today's lesson and prior learning can support the process of developing more extensive and better integrated conceptual frameworks. So this kind of constant drip feed, ongoing review and practice of ideas is what moves us towards expertise. So in planning teaching programs, we need to consider 2 scales of structure, both the large-scale progression of the spiral curriculum and the drip feed reinforcement that makes each stage of learning robust so it can act as the foundations for later development. At the outset of this lecture, I suggested I would discuss some key aspects of the nature of teaching in accord with constructivist learning theory, and represent these ideas as a series of slogans or mottos. This is not intended to be condescending. Rather, I hope I followed my own advice and packed up these ideas in a way that makes them accessible to the audience, just as I'm suggesting others do in their teaching. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith, for the lecture. Very inspiring and very insightful. Before we're taking questions, I have one question for you. I really like your lecture because you are applying all the 7 slogans in your lecture. I can see that. And especially when you're taking the Malaysian flag, you're taking the case of the couple Farah and Ashraf. I'm not sure, have you ever actually studied about Farah and Ashraf before you prepare your lecture?
I just chose some names. You're not telling me they're real people. Are they famous people?
Sort of, but anyway, yeah. So you are applying your slogans into the lecture today, but just I just want to know about the practicality of doing that, because it actually, as you told us that it took you about 6 weeks to prepare the lecture for today.
Yeah,
And I really
I wasn't
appreciate
working
that.
on it. I wasn't working on it full time for 6 weeks, but
Right.
once I finished the previous lecture, I thought I'd better get started on it because I'm a slow worker, very old, very slow.
But anyway, you make it, and it's very good. But I'm just asking for practicality in terms of for teachers. How can they apply this slogan of trying to make things unfamiliar to be familiar, to start where the students are from their point, from their quanta? How would you advise them on so that they are not working too hard to try to prepare things that from the perspective or from the starting point of the students, like the trend?
Okay, so that goes back to, I think it was my second or third slide, where I was sort of saying, well, there's an ideal that we aspire to, and then there's the reality that there's only so many hours in a week, that you might be teaching a room full of 150 people or something. There's all these practicalities. Sometimes you're working with students for 1 or 2 lectures, and then you'll move to something else, so you never get to know those students. All we can do is do our best with what we've got. But I think there are always things you can do to diagnose student learning. I mean, if you think about why do we do assessment? I mean, at the very end of a course, it may be necessary to find out if somebody meets the criteria to be awarded a degree or whatever. But for most of the time, the point of doing assessment is surely to find out how people are on the journey towards that final exam. So rather than giving them tests where the purpose is to say you've got 67%, we should be giving them activities where we can listen to what they're saying, we can hear them, we can talk to them, we can find out where they're going wrong, we can see where they may have misunderstood something. I mean, one of the things I think that happens a lot is that teachers will teach something that seems simple to them, and it's very hard to see actually this is more complicated if you haven't really spent 15 years thinking about this. And although when you say X, Y, Z, it's absolutely obvious to you that because you're teaching this subject and you're in this classroom, X, Y, and Z means this. But it may not mean this for the students because the words have slightly different meanings in everyday life, or they vaguely remember that we studied X 2 years ago and it was something to do with so-and-so, but they can't remember exactly what. So it's really hard for the teacher. The best thing you can do is talk to students. I mean, when I did my PhD, I was very lucky because I chose to do it on a project where I would basically be talking to students about their understanding of the subject I was teaching. And it was incredibly revealing. Now, clearly, most teachers, you haven't got time to start formally interviewing all the students in your classes. But you do have time to set up activities such that you go around the classroom, you listen to them, you have conversations with them. I mean, what I mean by conversational learning, I mean, at Cambridge, amongst other places, a big emphasis on dialogic. And the point about dialogic teaching is that it encourages different voices. So if you have a lecture, I mean, because of the nature of what I was doing today, I was the one doing all the talking. If I was working with a class in a room, I wouldn't want to talk for 45 minutes. I would want to maybe talk for 10 or 15 minutes and then stop and then have a brief activity or some questions so that I can tease out where the students are. Also, when you're teaching in a room, you look around the room, you see the faces. You see whether people are paying attention, whether they've drifted off, whether they're looking confused, whether they're checking their phones, So that gives you an idea of whether people are still engaged. And you invite the other person's voice. Because although you have the authority to account of the material, that may mean nothing to the other person. They may have a completely different understanding of something. I mean, one of the examples one of the things I mentioned there was about students actually misrepresenting lessons. So there's a study which has always struck me as being really significant, and it was to do with the topic of electricity. So apologies for those listening who don't teach electricity, but you don't need to understand electricity here. When students first meet very simple circuits, like different light bulbs connected with batteries, it's very common for them to have a particular kind of misunderstanding. And in this particular experiment, this particular research, what they did was they went to a class of students, I forget exactly, I think they were like 13, 14, if I remember. And before the lesson, they did a little poll to find out what they thought would happen in a certain situation. And most of the students had a misunderstanding of how electricity works. They then set up these demonstration experiments, asking the students what's going to happen now if I close this switch, and showing them what happened. And at the end of the lesson, most of the students realized they'd been completely wrong, misunderstood, and that actually they were wrong and they now knew things happened differently. Okay, that sounds like good teaching. We've diagnosed, we've taught accordingly, students have changed their mind. They then came back something like a month later and asked the same class of students again. Most of them had reverted to their original thinking. So although they'd learned during the lesson, because it hadn't been reinforced and built upon, over the preceding 3 or 4 weeks, they'd gone back to what they always thought, because that was quite firm in their minds. That was what seemed intuitive to them. They then said, but do you remember we showed you some experiments, some demonstrations? And the children said, yes. And they said to them, well, what happened? Well, quite a few of them remembered what didn't happen. You know, so they were meant to be seeing that when you have a series of light bulbs in a circuit connected to a battery, they're all equally bright all the way around. But what they actually said was, well, what we saw was the light bulb nearest the battery was brightest, the next light bulb was a bit less bright. Yeah, so it wasn't, they remembered the lesson, but they didn't remember what they'd been shown. They remembered vaguely some experiments with light bulbs and batteries, and their brain constructed an account of what must have happened based on their understanding. So now when they were thinking about that lesson, instead of them challenging their misconception, it was reinforcing it. Now, there's a lot of research like that. And the one thing I've really found about that is you never want to be in a criminal trial, on trial, when it's based on eyewitness evidence. Because people can say, hand on heart, I'm absolutely certain, I remember this is what I saw, and it wasn't what they saw, but they truly believe it because their memory has changed over time. So we have to keep working with students and pushing their memories in the right direction.
Okay.
I mean, obviously,
I'm very fascinated about the idea of the reconstruction of memory. So memory, we cannot trust the memory if that's true.
Yeah, and yet when we remember things, often we think we're so sure. Okay. Yeah. All right. I'll put it. I was so sure I went to a certain concert in 1976. I remember talking to people about this, and then years later, when I checked on the, now you can check everything on the web, and in 1976, the bands that played weren't bands I saw. I saw it in 1978. You know. All right. And you just become, over time, you become convinced you know certain things. And you can be completely wrong.
But the point is, assessment is very important when we're doing constructivist teaching, right? Yeah.
It's important to keep a conversation going that's constantly checking what the student understands, how they've interpreted what you've told them, whether they're linking to the prior ideas you want them to link to, and whether they're linking to them in the right way. And students will also make very creative links. They will say, oh, I understand this. It's a bit like so-and-so. And sometimes it is, and that's helpful. And sometimes it's not. And you need to kind of point out that's not how it is before that becomes firmed up in their mind.
We have to listen to the interpretation most of the time, so we know that what actually they understand. Right. So there's a question from Zuaini. She asked, I'm not she here, I think it's she. How does constructivism affect students' learning in the class, especially for low performing students who are at the last class or really performing poorly? How does it affect the learning?
Well, I think these principles apply to all students. But of course, the problem is that when you're teaching a class, you will have some students in that class who are maybe gifted, if you use that language.
You
might have some students in that class who are slow learners, whatever term you want to use. You'll have some students in that class who this is their favorite topic. This is their hobby as well as their subject to study, and they read on this topic for fun in their spare time. You'll have students who revise every lesson and rewrite their notes after every class, and others who just do the minimum. So the principles, I mean, the research suggests these principles apply to everyone. But of course, the trouble is what the teacher's trying to do is tune the teaching to fit with where the learner is, what they currently understand, what they can make sense of. And it won't be the same for everyone.
I think that's the way that teacher thinks that they want how much time they want to invest in teaching the student. So like high performing student or the so-called gifted, they would try to spend more time, so they would try to use more constructivist teaching. And so maybe, I mean, some teachers would think that it's a kind of like, I'm sorry to say, a bit waste of time of teaching students who just don't care, who just don't want to study. So they would just feel that it's a waste of time to invest so much time to assess, to reflect, to use constructivist teaching. I'm not sure. What do you think about that?
I mean, I have some sympathy. I mean, when I was a teacher, I always, as a school teacher, for example, or college teacher, I always credited effort. If the student was making the effort, I always had time for them. So I do sometimes think that it's easy for teachers to think, well, some students aren't making the effort. And I think that's a human response. Why are we going to put more effort in when they're not trying?
Yeah.
It's their responsibility to learn. But I mean, I think there are two things against that. One is the fact that you have a kind of contractual obligation. If you're being employed as a teacher, then you do have some responsibility to all the learners, because somebody's paying for their education. They have paid fees, or a sponsor has paid fees on their behalf, or whatever. So there is that kind of contractual obligation. That's a moral obligation. And there's also the question of, why is it that learners are not making the effort if they're in this class? Now, of course, in a school, it may be just because the law says you go to school. But sometimes students aren't making effort because over many years they've learned that they don't understand, they can't keep up, it doesn't make sense, they get it wrong. If you do a job where you fail every day and everybody tells you fail every day, after a while you'd resign. If you can't resign because it's school and the law says you have to go, then what else do you do? Well, you can make a superhuman effort to do your best, but if that's not working, perhaps you give up. Perhaps it's better to be seen not to be making an effort and to be considered to be failing because you aren't bothered, than to be seen to be making an effort and be considered to be stupid or slow or dim or something. What would you rather be? Would you rather be seen to be not bothered, or would you rather be seen to be completely stupid? So we have to sometimes think that, there are reasons, and of course some students are coming from situations where their parents are going through a divorce, or a close family member is dying of cancer, or maybe on odd occasions they're actually being abused at home, they're being beaten or something, or they're not being fed properly because there's not enough food, or whatever. There might be real issues at home, which mean that coming to class and learning about acids and bases or whatever the topic is, well, why would they be interested? So I think you have to have a little bit of compassion and understanding. At the end of the day, if somebody doesn't want to learn, they're not going to learn. But you can't just give up on people and assume that the situation is they're not bothered because they're not bothered. Maybe they appear to be not bothered because they've got no idea how to get started. They're so far behind. Or maybe they're not bothered because they're actually terrified of what's going to happen at lunchtime or when they get home and they can't get their mind clear. So as a teacher, you have to engage.
Right. Agree. Totally agree with you. There's a question from Mangai Solomon. Thank you, Prof. Dr. Tabor. Identifying these 7 slogans to improve constructivist teaching is quite significant for us as teachers. Please, can learners in the same vein have any role to play in making it easier for teachers to bring the teaching procedure via the slogans cited come to reality?
Well, I think there is something that, as teachers, we're the educational professionals. And the students aren't. And in one way, that simply means that we have the expertise. But the same things I've been saying about our expertise as subject teachers also apply to our expertise as pedagogues. So if you're teaching a subject, if you're teaching economics or biology, you have to remember that the students in the class don't have your level of background knowledge about that particular subject. But they're also not teachers. So sometimes we can forget that we have been trained and we have experience in understanding what the educational process is about. And although it's not for us to give the students the responsibility to be teachers, that's our responsibility. If we want to give them the responsibility to be learners, they need to understand something about the educational process. You know, so for example, I remember a class when I taught in a school where the teacher had a really engaging discussion about something, I don't know, nuclear power or something. The students were really engaged in the lesson. And there was a little comment at the end of the student from one of the students going out of the lesson. Well, that was a great lesson. We didn't have to do any work. They didn't have to do any work because they weren't asked to write anything down. Well, actually, they did a lot of work because they were engaged in thinking about the material that's being presented. They were engaged in a discussion. But for many students, the work is the notes they write down. And they're more bothered about getting the notes down than they are in understanding. Because they seem to think if you've got the notes down and you revise them, you'll do well in the test. Now, of course, if you have a system where assessment is all based on recall, then that may actually be true, they may be right. But hopefully we're working in systems where the thing we really prize is understanding. And of course you have to remember some stuff to understand, but it's the understanding we're testing, not the recall primarily. And if you don't understand it in the lesson, then probably your notes aren't going to help you understand it later. So if students understand a bit more about what we're doing and why we're doing it and what's important, the notes aren't the important thing. It's the learning that's important, the understanding that's important. The notes help us with that process. The talk is important. You know, when we do assessment, you know, if we think assessment is all about getting an A star, 8 out of 10, 92%, then they're going to think that. If we think that most assessment is about understanding where we are and how we can move on, then they can engage in that process better. So it's not for us to get them to be teachers, but it is for us to help them understand the aspects of what the educational process is about, what we're trying to do, what we're trying to achieve, so they don't come away with the wrong idea that it's all about writing down notes, that's what the work in the class is. It's a bit like doing the experiment and making sure, I mean, when I was an undergraduate, I actually know that the way to get good marks in your practical work was to borrow the lab report from somebody who got good marks last year and basically copy it. And I wouldn't do that because I didn't think that was the right thing to do. I thought it was more about understanding the experiment. And therefore I got lousy marks on my practical work. You know, because the system wasn't set up for education. But hopefully that was a long time ago. And I'm hoping we've moved on a bit now. So we need to share with students certain things.
We are moving, but we are still not there yet. We are still testing their recall, the memories, what they actually remember rather than what they understand. I know we inspired towards getting towards the understanding, their thinking skills and so on, but we are not yet there yet. I think in Malaysia we are not there. I'm not sure about other places.
Well, it's true everywhere, but I don't think we give up. You know, because there's no point teaching people to learn how to. It's a bit like, you know, one time history used to be taught as a lot of dates. You know, what's the date this king came to power? What's the date this king died? What was the date of this battle? Now, I was very lucky when I went to school. I didn't have that kind of history. I had history that was about understanding the Industrial Revolution and social change and so on. You know, but if it's all about a load of dates, what is the point of that? When does anybody ever use that apart from in an exam? So we've really got to move on from that. There is no point. I mean, especially in the modern age, because if you want to know the date of some battle or something, we've all got the internet. Why would anybody need to know that? There's no harm in learning facts because some facts are useful. So in my subject in chemistry, if you study a lot of chemistry, you will know that carbon is atomic number 6, has atomic mass 12. You will pick up these things along the way. You know, and there are things you do have to learn. But if you don't understand anything, the facts are completely pointless. They have to fit into a framework.
Agree. But there's a long way for us to go to get there, I think. But we'll get there. So there's a last question from Shantini. We don't have time. I think this will be our last question. Thank you, Professor Kaber. There is much controversy concerning the use of constructivist principles for teaching children with learning disabilities. What is your point of view on this?
I wasn't aware of this.
Right.
So I'm not sure what the controversy is. Because
I'm not sure as well.
I mean, I think I can't see any reason why there would be any problem in applying constructivist principles anywhere where you want to bring about learning. I think the problem is the distinction between constructivist principles and what is sometimes labeled constructivist teaching. So, I mean, there's a famous paper from the United States where they basically talked about the failure of constructivist teaching, inquiry learning, discovery learning, problem-based learning. And they said all these things are the same and they're all a failure because they put all the onus on the students and the students can't take the responsibility. And that
Probably that's the point. Yeah, probably putting the ownership or the responsibility of learning on the students.
Yeah. Now, that paper had used the phrase minimal guidance. And it was talking about teaching where the teacher largely lets the students find things out for themselves. Yeah? And if that's what people's idea of teaching is, then I agree. Teachers aren't doing their job properly. And that's true whoever the students are. Now, of course, if you do let students find out for themselves, the gifted students will probably make a success of it. Yeah? And if you've got students who are struggling, just saying go and find out and work for yourself, there's no point in that. I mean, can I just go back to my slides?
Yeah, you can.
If I can find
you can just
right
share
part.
the slides.
Yeah. So, do I need to do anything rather than this? Is this going to work?
You have to share. Yeah. Okay, that's good.
Is that okay?
That's correct. Yeah.
So this is I mean, obviously this is an example from physics, and I'm very aware in this lecture that people are from different subjects, and physics may not be everybody's subject. So this rather odd-looking task is designed as a task that allows people to discover that a certain kind of arrangement called a couple has particular qualities. So this could be seen as a discovery learning task. Now, if you gave this to your average class of 15-year-olds and said, get on with it because this is constructivist learning, then I would agree that is not good teaching. But the point is you have a task and you give the task to the class, and maybe there are some students in the class who will run with this, who will say, okay, that's interesting, that's a challenge, I wonder what we have to do here, let's try some things. And they may well progress. There are other students who are probably capable of doing this, but won't have the confidence, won't know where to start. And so they're the ones where you give them a little bit of structure, a few hints, a few suggestions, get them going. And there are other students that will need to be taken through it by some quite detailed instructions of what to do. Yeah? So that's an example of where you say, we're going to let the students try and discover something, but we're not going to assume they can all just go away and do it. Some of them might be able to do this with very little help. Others will need some hints, some ideas, some suggestions. Others are going to need really to be taken through stage by stage. And that's the point, that it's constructivist learning is about offering the optimal level of guidance. And the optimal level of guidance will be different from one class to another, and even for different students in the class. If you're offering minimal guidance, that's not doing constructivist teaching. So it's constructivist if you get the guidance right. And if you get the guidance right, then it works for everybody. But of course, that means you don't have the same guidance for everybody. And one other thing I'd just say, Fatin, is also, I mean, I've done quite a bit of work on gifted learning, and one of the things I want to be very clear about is, although it's important to pitch work for different students, you shouldn't assume that there are some gifted students and there are some slow learners, and they're always the same people, because actually, in different subjects, you'll get different students doing well. So sometimes it'd be interesting for teachers in school to talk to people in very different departments, and they may get a very different idea about some of the students they teach. But also, even within the same subject, some people will be good at one thing and some people will be good at another thing. And, you know, so you can't always assume you know who's going to need a lot of help and who won't need a lot of help. It may sometimes depend on the activity. And of course, sometimes you get a student who's got a particular hobby or a particular part-time job or something like that, and they bring particular expertise that means a particular example they're really strong on, and they can support others in that. whereas normally you think they weren't particularly a fast learner. So you shouldn't assume in advance. I mean, you'll have an idea, you'll have a notion in advance who's going to need what support, but you should always be a little bit flexible, and respond to what's actually happening in the classroom.
So it's very important for teachers to spend time to try to understand the learners, listen to the interpretation as they explain the dialogues and so the arguments, or the assessment, so we know where our students are, what they understand, what they're familiar with. I think the principle of making the unfamiliar familiar, I think that is very important. And for each students, their level of familiarity with things, with subjects, with context are very different. And we, as teachers, we really have to play the role to try to understand them. Even if it's a big class, we still have to try to understand them. And there's lots of ways to do it, like what you say, give them a piece of paper for them to write their understanding, or just answer something simple that we can just trace or try to interpret what they understand. That's
And you have to think over the long term. So if somebody comes into a lesson not knowing about some concept, and you teach them that concept, and at the end of the lesson they seem to have really understood it, they can do a really good job of explaining it, and they can show you how to apply it. You can't assume that will still be the same a week later, because if there's no follow-up, it probably dissipates.
Right.
So learning things that are important is a long-term process. When you first learn something, it's fragile, it's not well connected, it's not easily accessed, and when it's brought to memory, it's likely to be distorted. Only over a long period of time do you build up expertise, by keep going back and working with things, refining things, checking things, So you become an expert because you engage with something in depth over a long period of time.
Okay. Right. Okay. Thank you, Keith, for the explanation. I think we don't have time for any other questions. I want to thank you so much for your time, your effort in preparing the notes, the lectures. There are so many positive comments from our listeners, our viewers out there. Dr. Nina is just flashing some of them. We'll give you the link and you can have a look at all the comments there. Thank you so much, Keith.
Thank you.
I'm going to miss you, but we'll try to organize something else after the adjunct lecture, if you're happy to do it.
Okay. You take
All
care.
right. You take care. Goodbye, Keith. Thank you.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right, that's it for our adjunct professor lecture for this time. And thank you so much for staying until nearly 6 o'clock today. I hope this won't be the last. And we're gonna have another adjunct professor lecture next on the 1st of April. Do join us. Dr. Nina has more detail on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof. Fatin, for moderating the session. It's a really engaging session, I suppose. Thank you. Okay, so guys, as mentioned by Prof. Fatin, someone did text me, during the session. The time text me saying that, did you help Prof. Keith making the slides? Because I have all the Malaysian culture, Farah, Ashraf, and everything. And I was saying that it is made purely by Prof. Keith. It takes about 6 weeks for him to prepare those beautiful contents of the lecture. So do appreciate and do enjoy the session. I believe a lot of people very enjoy the session. And as mentioned by Prof. Fatin, we have this coming Professor Adjunct series by Datuk Habibah on 1st April. We'll give you guys the details later. But this is confirmed. The next sharing will be on 7th April by Datuk Frida Muhammad Pidus from Cempaka Education Group. So she'll be sharing about curriculum delivery and syllabus development in Cempaka School. So please make sure to book your dates and join us in the session. So drop your comments, do share this video if you find it. This is very beneficial. So I think that's all. See you guys in the next session. Bye. Have a good weekend. Tomorrow is holiday for Johor, and stay safe. Bye. Take care.